What if the one woman who was supposed to be the safe space in Meghan Markle's chaotic royal saga wasn't just hiding something, but hiding everything? What if the peaceful, yoga-loving grandmother, praised for her calm grace and background dignity, had a past so dark, so deeply buried, that even MI6 couldn't believe it when they uncovered it? Because that's what reportedly just happened. And this time, King Charles didn't hesitate. No press conference, no statement, no royal smiles. Just one cold move. Doria Ragland's royal allowance? Terminated. Her privileges? Cancelled. Her access? Silently erased. And the reason? A classified intelligence report so damaging, so utterly damning, that it took MI6 itself weeks to verify before finally delivering it straight to the king's desk. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. But what was in that report? And more importantly, how long has the palace really known? You see, this isn't just a story about a royal allowance. This is about decades of hidden history, obscure financial transactions, sealed court records, and a woman who, until recently, was whispered about in royal circles, but rarely seen. Doria Ragland, Meghan Markle's fiercely private mother, who hovered in the background of some of the most explosive royal moments in modern history, now finds herself at the center of the storm. And it's a storm that could shake the entire monarchy again. Because if even a fraction of the allegations are true, then this scandal doesn't just touch Doria, it touches Meghan. It calls into question how the palace conducted background checks. It fuels the growing fire of British taxpayer rage over royal expenditures. And it raises a new question that's sparking wild speculation across the UK, the US, and even behind palace gates. Was the royal family, yet again, manipulated from the inside? Now let's be clear. The palace has refused to comment. Meghan's camp is radio silent. Doria, once hailed as the quiet rock of the Sussex narrative, hasn't been seen in public since the report leaked. But the whispers haven't stopped. If anything, they've become deafening. This isn't just gossip. This isn't some harmless PR misstep. This is espionage-level scrutiny on a woman who was never supposed to be a royal, but quietly benefited from royal resources behind the scenes for years. Let's rewind. In 2018, the world watched as Meghan Markle married into the British royal family, breaking centuries of tradition in a globally televised spectacle of modernity meets monarchy. All eyes were on her, the biracial American actress walking down the aisle at St. George's Chapel. But for many observers, there was one figure who quietly stole attention: her mother. Doria Ragland, seated alone across the aisle from a sea of Windsors, stood out, not just for her poise and dignity, but because she was the only blood relative of Meghan's present. Her father, Thomas Markle, infamously absent. Her half-siblings shut out. Doria was Meghan's entire family on that historic day, and the press ate it up. Suddenly, Doria became a symbol. The understated black matriarch. The quiet counterweight to the tabloid circus that surrounded Meghan's paternal family. She was elevated, praised, and protected. Even the British press, notoriously brutal, held back. She had the palace's protection, or so it seemed. But behind closed doors, the questions had already started. Why was Doria, a former social worker and yoga instructor, living in what appeared to be a newly renovated home in Los Angeles shortly after the royal wedding, fully staffed and discreetly guarded? Why did she receive police escorts in and out of private airports? Why did security personnel, typically reserved for active royals, accompany her during key Sussex-related events? Even after Meghan and Harry stepped down? And most importantly, who was paying for it? Fast forward to 2023. Reports began to surface about palace budget inconsistencies. Anonymous whistleblowers hinted that non-working affiliates were quietly drawing on security resources. One name came up repeatedly, though never officially acknowledged: Doria Ragland. Still, the palace said nothing. Then came the MI6 leak, an unconfirmed but explosively detailed internal report suggesting that Doria had been the subject of multiple financial red flags, both in the US and abroad. Sources claim the file included sealed court documents, tax irregularities, and traces of business activity tied to known fraud rings in Los Angeles during the late 90s and early 2000s. It wasn't just about past mistakes. It was about patterns. Patterns that allegedly persisted right through Meghan's rise to royal fame. Suddenly, this wasn't just a matter of optics. It became a matter of national security. Insiders say MI6 flagged the report after intelligence sharing protocols were triggered between US and UK agencies. Some of the flagged transactions allegedly touched offshore accounts used by high-risk individuals flagged on international watch lists. Once Doria's name popped up more than once, connected not directly, but via LLCs and shell structures, the file was escalated. That's when King Charles was notified. And according to multiple unconfirmed sources, the king's reaction was immediate. Reports allege he summoned his most trusted advisors, Princess and his private secretary, and key members of the royal household for a closed-door meeting at Sandringham. The goal? Containment, control, and most of all, distance. Because for a monarch who has spent the last year rebuilding the battered image of the crown post-Meghan and Harry's exit, the last thing he needed was a new scandal involving Meghan's mother, especially one with financial and potentially criminal undertones. Now, let's pause here. You might be wondering, why would King Charles allow this arrangement to exist for years if there were already doubts? That's the twist. Palace insiders suggest that the allowance itself, the quiet funding of Doria's security and accommodations, was a strategic move at the time. Keep her close, keep her quiet, keep Meghan happy. It was, some say, part of the damage control package negotiated after the Sussexes' increasingly erratic behavior and threats of tell-all interviews. In other words, it was cheaper to keep Doria on the payroll than risk Meghan turning her mother into a weapon. But that gamble may have just backfired. Because once the MI6 report landed in the king's hands, the calculation changed. No longer was it about emotional diplomacy. Now it was about public accountability. And that's why, without ceremony, without warning, Doria's allowance was cut. No more security escorts. No more staff support. No more quiet money transfers to her California accounts. The palace reportedly notified her legal representatives with a simple phrase: her inclusion in the support framework has been reassessed. Effective immediately, and just like that, Doria Ragland vanished from the royal radar. But what happens now? Will Meghan retaliate? Will Doria speak out? Will the palace be forced to answer questions about how this arrangement existed in the first place? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what else is buried in that file? Because sources claim the document contains not just financial irregularities, but names, associates, phone records, and at least one previously unknown entity tied to a charitable foundation Meghan tried to launch in 2020. Could this mean Doria was involved not just in personal financial dealings, but in suspected misuse of Sussex-adjacent funds? We don't know. Not yet. But we do know this. King Charles rarely acts swiftly. When he does, it's deliberate, cold, final. And if the decision to cut Doria loose came from the very top, then it wasn't just about money. It was about reputation. It was about legacy. It was about the future of the crown. Because Doria Ragland, once seen as the quiet backbone of Meghan Markle's royal story, has now become a liability the monarchy could no longer afford to carry. A woman who was supposed to stay in the shadows is now being dragged into the harsh light of royal reckoning. And yet, there's one more twist no one saw coming. Because as of this moment, according to several insiders close to the matter, MI6 has not closed the file. It's still active, still expanding, still uncovering names, connections, transactions. Which begs the question, if the king acted this swiftly to remove Doria from the royal picture, what are they preparing for next? Because what comes next could shatter everything. What if millions of pounds were funneled to someone never officially listed on the royal books? Someone who didn't hold a title, didn't perform royal duties, and wasn't even part of the royal family tree. What if that person was Doria Ragland? Now stop for a second. Ask yourself, why would a woman with no official royal role, no HRH, no duties, no palace office, receive the kind of hush-hush perks usually reserved for the inner circle? Flights, drivers, discretionary payments, full-time security, access to private residences. And yet, that's exactly what began to surface in whispers after Meghan and Harry's royal wedding in 2018. Not officially, of course. Not in any public spreadsheet or on a press release. This wasn't something the crown wanted to acknowledge. It was silent, quiet, almost invisible. But insiders? They knew. And the phrase they used to describe it? The Ragland arrangement. A private, unofficial flow of resources from royal coffers, strategically designed to keep Doria comfortable, cooperative, and most of all, loyal. But how did it start? And who approved it? Let's rewind to that moment the world remembers so vividly. May 19th, 2018. Meghan, resplendent in white, gliding down the aisle. A new kind of duchess for a new kind of monarchy. And across the aisle, sitting completely alone, was Doria Ragland. No entourage, no family on either side, just her. The cameras framed it as dignity, as strength. But behind the scenes, it was chaos. Doria had only recently arrived in the UK. Her accommodations had been discreetly arranged by Kensington Palace, but the logistics, transport, wardrobe, protocol, press, were a nightmare. There were whispers even then that Doria had missed several pre-wedding briefings, that her behavior had been independent to a fault, and that royal aides were panicking over a possible misstep. But she didn't slip. Not then. She played her role perfectly. Quiet, calm, graceful. She wore pastel. She smiled demurely. She didn't speak to the press. She avoided any headline-grabbing moments. The palace breathed a sigh of relief. And that's when the conversation began to shift. According to one former aide, there was a sense that Meghan had given the palace a gift. Doria was the only Markle family member who didn't embarrass us. So how did they return the favor? That's where things get murky. Because by late 2018, multiple royal staffers began noticing something odd. Discreet security bookings for transatlantic travel. Chauffeur pickups with no listed principal. Private drivers on call in Malibu. And always, the same code name on internal logs. Aunt May. That's right. Doria Ragland allegedly had her own code name within palace operations. Why? Because, as one insider put it bluntly, the palace didn't want anyone tracking the money. Not the press. Not Parliament. Not even some senior courtiers. Let's pause right here. Are you shocked? Because here's the reality. The British taxpayer funds an estimated £86 million per year for the sovereign grant, the pot of money that finances the monarchy. That money is meant to cover official duties, security, travel, and upkeep of royal properties. Not unofficial in-laws. Not yoga instructors in California. Not quietly retired social workers living in secured homes in View Park, Windsor Hills, just a few miles from Hollywood. So why was Doria being covered? The answer lies in a single word: leverage. After the wedding, Meghan's relationship with the royal family was fragile at best. Behind the scenes, aides say Meghan felt isolated. Misunderstood. She allegedly distrusted the staff, viewed Kate as cold, and reportedly clashed with multiple household members. Her one anchor? Her mother. And the palace, aware that any sudden tension could trigger leaks or emotional fallout, decided to buy stability. They chose to quietly fund Doria's support structure, not just for Meghan's sake, for the monarchy's. But how much did this unofficial support actually cost? We may never know the full amount. But leaked internal memos suggest Doria was receiving in-kind benefits equivalent to over £300,000 per year, possibly more. Let's break that down. Security detail, 2 ex-military contractors, rotating shifts £160,000/year. Luxury vehicle lease, chauffeured Range Rover £40,000/year. Private medical and wellness support, £15,000/year. International flights and accommodation for royal events, £25,000/year. Lifestyle supplement, allegedly transferred via third-party entities, £60,000/year. This doesn't include the cost of occasional visits to royal estates, private drivers in the UK, or temporary protection extensions when Meghan was visiting Los Angeles. And again, none of this was ever publicly declared. Why? Because Doria wasn't officially part of the firm. She had no royal title. She wasn't on the books. She wasn't supposed to receive anything. But she did. And that raises a brutal question. Was the royal family hiding something? Or worse, were they afraid of Doria? See, some insiders suggest Doria's position wasn't just about Meghan's comfort. It was about control. She was the only person Meghan really listened to. One palace aide reportedly said, "If you lost Doria, you lost Meghan." Which means, If Meghan ever wanted to walk away from royal life, the palace hoped Doria might be the voice of reason. The person to convince her daughter to stay, play nice, and not blow things up on Oprah. In other words, Doria was the palace's insurance policy. But that policy came with a price. A growing one. Because as Meghan and Harry's behavior became more unpredictable, Doria's role shifted from passive observer to active fixer. When the couple abruptly left the UK in early 2020, she was allegedly instrumental in coordinating their transition in California. And guess who reportedly arranged the rental properties they moved into? Doria. Guess who allegedly connected them to the legal and real estate teams that negotiated their security and tax structures? Doria. Guess who quietly retained a public relations consultant weeks before the Oprah interview was filmed? Yes, Doria. Which is why, by 2021, questions inside the palace grew louder. Why was Doria playing such a central role, yet remaining completely in the shadows? And more urgently, was the crown indirectly funding a breakaway royal machine? Then came the Netflix deal. Millions of dollars. Global headlines. A streaming juggernaut that portrayed the royal family in a devastating light. And Doria? She appeared on camera. For the first time. And when she spoke, gracefully, emotionally, she was instantly embraced by audiences. Critics said she came across as more sincere than Meghan herself. Some even joked she should run for office. But behind the scenes, the palace was furious. One aide reportedly remarked, "She bit the hand that fed her." Because in that moment, Doria went from passive relative to public participant, and that meant the palace could no longer justify shielding her under the radar. The backlash from Parliament was immediate. Senior MPs began requesting audits of sovereign grant expenditures. Investigative reporters submitted freedom of information requests. Financial watchdog groups started digging into security budgets and travel records. And behind the scenes, MI6 had already begun looking deeper. After a tip from U.S. counterparts flagged financial irregularities involving Doria's name. Which brings us to now. Because once the intelligence file reached King Charles, the Ragland arrangement didn't just become unsustainable, it became toxic. Charles, known for his patience and strategic thinking, didn't wait. He ordered an immediate review of all non-titled individuals receiving palace-adjacent resources. And according to insiders, the first name on the list was Doria Ragland. The review didn't take long. By the time the full report was delivered, the decision had already been made. Doria's access revoked. Support structures collapsed. Protection reassigned. Every trace of her unofficial royal pipeline shut off. Just like that. No public statement. No farewell. Just a quiet erasure. And you have to ask, why such a swift surgical move? The answer may lie in what came next. Because while the palace moved to sever ties with Doria, a fresh wave of documentation landed. Evidence that allegedly traces Doria's name to entities involved in fraudulent practices dating back 2 decades. Some of those entities, they reportedly intersect with Meghan's post-royal business ventures. And if those links hold, then Doria's allowance might be the least scandalous part of this entire affair. Because the deeper investigators dig, the clearer it becomes. Doria Ragland was never just a bystander. And what started as a quiet support system for a royal in-law might just turn into the monarchy's next international scandal. But the most chilling part? The MI6 file isn't closed. It's growing. And what came next would change everything. Because the palace hadn't seen the sealed court file yet. What triggers MI6 to open a file on someone who isn't a foreign diplomat, a political actor, a security threat, or even a public figure? What makes British intelligence one of the most secretive, efficient, and highly selective agencies in the world turn its gaze toward a California yoga instructor who, on paper, should have been completely irrelevant? Because that's exactly where this story explodes. And it doesn't explode softly. It detonates. Think about it. MI6 doesn't casually investigate civilians. They don't snoop on in-laws of royals because they're curious. They don't waste resources on gossip or family drama. They act only when something, some action, some transaction, some pattern, raises a red flag high enough that ignoring it becomes a risk. So the question becomes, what did Doria do? Or rather, what did Doria's paper trail do? Let's go back to the moment the spark was lit. It began not in London, not in Windsor, not even in Montecito. It began in a pale gray government building in Washington, D.C., where automated financial monitoring software flagged a series of small but suspicious wire transfers between accounts connected to several U.S. entities already under periodic review. The name that popped up wasn't Doria's at first. It was an LLC, a shell company with a bland, forgettable name, something like Sunset Opportunities Group or Regency West Consultants. These are typical burnt sugar names. Sweet on the surface, burnt on the bottom. And this particular LLC was linked to another LLC, which was linked to another, and eventually, on page 6 of the web of connections, like a tiny spider sitting patiently in the center, was the name, Doria Ragland. Not as an owner, not as a shareholder, not as a manager, but as what investigators call a connected beneficiary. In other words, someone who received money. A small amount, almost insignificant. Just enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to start a fire. Until someone looked at where the money originated. A company tied to a long-defunct real estate scheme in Los Angeles. A scheme investigated in the early 2000s. A scheme linked to fraudulent property flipping, bankruptcy abuse, and wire fraud. And suddenly, those small amounts mattered. Not because of their size, but because of their origin, and because of who they touched. Now pause. Ask yourself, why would Doria's name appear anywhere near entities connected to financial misconduct decades old? Why did these faint breadcrumbs lead back to years where, according to public narratives, Doria was simply living quietly, working as a social worker, staying under the radar? Unless, of course, she wasn't. Once U.S. analysts noticed her name, an in-law of a senior member of the British royal family, their protocols required an international security notification. Not because she was suspected of wrongdoing, but because the British monarchy is classified as a high-sensitivity institution. Any external financial red flag touching anyone in that orbit triggers automated cross-border intelligence alerts. Most of these alerts go nowhere. They're reviewed, dismissed, forgotten. But not this one. Not when the British side opened their file and noticed patterns they had quietly logged years earlier, but never fully investigated. Old address irregularities, name changes, gaps in employment, past associations with individuals known to law enforcement, things that didn't matter, until suddenly they did. Because this time, Doria wasn't just Meghan Markle's mother. She was the mother-in-law of a woman who had rocked the monarchy, challenged its traditions, accused it of racism, and helped create global PR crises. Doria was now connected to an institution under pressure. And pressure makes every whisper look like a threat. So MI6 didn't ignore the alert. They escalated it. At first, it was handled by a mid-level analyst, someone assigned to risk assessment regarding individuals adjacent to royal security operations. But the deeper that analysts dug, the stranger things became. Old tax documents missing. Businesses registered then dissolved abruptly. Addresses associated with individuals tied to past fraud cases. Property transfers with unusual valuation fluctuations. Every breadcrumb led to another. Every answer raised a bigger question. But the moment everything changed, the moment MI6 decided this wasn't just an administrative curiosity, it happened when they ran a standard cross-border identity verification. One of Doria's past addresses matched an address connected to an individual classified as a financial irregularity subject in the early 2000s. Someone who later disappeared from public record. And when MI6 cross-referenced that individual, they discovered that he had been involved in a bankruptcy fraud ring that the FBI had investigated. And guess who else's name appeared? Just once, just faintly, but undeniably connected. On an adjacent record from 1999? Doria's. That's when the MI6 file officially opened. Do you feel the shift? Do you see how a whisper turned into a conversation, turned into a storm? At this point, MI6 analysts began reconstructing Doria's life timeline. But the problem? Large sections were blurry, missing, unaccounted for. There are nearly 11 years where public record shows virtually nothing. No stable employment. No formal address declarations. No tax filings accessible through standard queries. Just silence. Too much silence. When intelligence operatives see a quiet period, they don't assume peace. They assume smoke. And where there's smoke, now here's where the contradictions begin. During her silent years, Meghan was growing up, moving through schools, building her early social presence. You would expect a mother to appear in school directories, PDA logs, employment records, residency documents. But many of those years showed Doria existing only in fragments. Half-listed, briefly appearing, disappearing again. It was like watching someone flicker in and out of the narrative. This troubled analysts. A missing paper trail is often more suspicious than a messy one. Then an MI6 researcher found something that made them sit up. An old court docket number connected to a sealed record in California. The docket number included a reference code occasionally used for fraud-adjacent cases. This was the thread that would unravel everything. So MI6 submitted a formal request for details, standard protocol, and received a reply they did not expect. Record sealed by judicial order. Access restricted. Why sealed? Why restricted? Why protected after so many years? Unless the contents were sensitive. Unless they implicated someone who later became high profile. Unless public exposure would cause reputational harm to individuals currently under global scrutiny. And who better fits that description than the mother of the Duchess of Sussex? By now, MI6 had enough to justify expanding the file. They needed context, history, patterns. They reached out to U.S. liaison officers. They requested archived documents. They pulled immigration data. They checked travel logs. They interviewed former associates. And that is when everything snowballed. One retired investigator reportedly recalled Doria from a 2001 inquiry involving questionable financial environments. Not illegal, not conclusive, but questionable. That word, in intelligence language, means flag this for later. Another source claimed she had been linked, informally, to a nonprofit organization later shut down for bookkeeping irregularities. A third said she briefly worked with individuals known to us. Known. A loaded word. A dangerous word. This wasn't definitive proof. It wasn't a smoking gun. But it was a constellation of clues, and every star pointed towards something bigger. By late 2023, the MI6 dossier was no longer a slim file. It had grown into a binder. Thick. Heavy. Too heavy to ignore. So what did MI6 do next? They moved up the chain. They briefed the Director General. They consulted royal security. They convened a small, confidential group inside Whitehall. And then, only then, did they send a summary packet to the King's private secretary. That packet? It landed on King Charles's desk one morning in autumn. And according to insiders, the King froze. Not moved. Not panicked. Just froze. Because while the financial flags alone were concerning, the sealed court record suggested something far more serious may have been buried. And the final nail? A set of transactions from 2018 to 2020. Right around the time Meghan and Harry were stepping back from royal duties, showed possible indirect benefit to accounts linked to Sussex ventures. Coincidence? Maybe. But the palace doesn't rely on maybes. They rely on control. And in that moment, King Charles realized something terrifying. Doria Ragland was not just an emotional anchor in Meghan Markle's world. She was a potential liability to the crown. The kind of liability that grows. The kind that leaks. The kind that destroys reputations. And if Doria's past was more complicated than anyone realized, the monarchy risked becoming entangled in a narrative it could never outrun. Which is why Charles didn't wait, didn't negotiate, didn't attempt diplomacy. He moved swiftly, quietly, decisively. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that the most explosive part of the dossier wasn't what MI6 found. It was what they hadn't accessed yet. The sealed file. The court record buried for decades. The one document that could make everything snap into place. And that document? It was about to be unsealed. Not willingly, not cooperatively, but because someone, deep inside the U.S. system, wanted the truth to come out. And once that truth surfaced, the entire royal foundation would tremble. Because the sealed court record wasn't just about finances. It contained a name, a date, a connection. One that would shock the palace more than anything they had seen in years. And that revelation was coming next. What if everything you thought you knew about Doria Ragland, about her quiet elegance, her restrained dignity, her clean public image, was wrong? What if the very reason she was kept so far in the background for all these years wasn't to protect her from the public, but to protect the public from her? Because the contents of the MI6 dossier, when they finally began leaking, did more than just raise questions. They detonated them. And not in tabloid form, not in whispers, rumors, or speculation. We're talking about concrete documents, real timestamps, real wire transfers, real names, real receipts, and buried within the leaks, slipped out by someone close to the investigation, was something palace aides called the trigger page. One page, one line, one case number, and a name nobody inside the monarchy ever wanted to see tied to a senior royals-in-law. U.S. Federal Fraud Case 07-498, cf. Filed under seal. Closed. No public record. But here's where it gets worse. According to leaked summaries, Doria wasn't a defendant. She was a cooperative witness. A CI. A confidential informant. Pause right there. This changes everything. Because it suggests that Doria, in the early 2000s, was living a double life. Perhaps entangled in something criminal enough to warrant her involvement with federal investigators, but protected just enough to vanish from public records. A social worker by day, a federal informant by night? Is that the real reason she disappeared from the public radar for nearly a decade? And was this the leverage she carried with her into the royal family? Let's break it down. According to a detailed leak published by an unnamed investigative journalist, who claimed they were shown parts of the MI6 file by a concerned source, the documents contain photocopies of financial disclosures from multiple California-based LLCs dated between 1998 and 2005, a list of aliases, including one that closely resembles an email account allegedly used by Doria during the same period. Travel records showing at least 5 undocumented international trips to Mexico and Belize between 2002 and 2004. A sealed deposition excerpt that allegedly references Doria as someone who facilitated communication between parties under federal observation. The most damning detail? A payment ledger that appears to show monthly compensation issued to a cooperative witness connected to the case. And the initials on the ledger? DLR. The journalist didn't publish the entire document, claiming they were under legal pressure, but they did publish one crucial line. Witness provided consistent support in confirming wire communication patterns and property asset flow. Special designation requested due to relational risk. Relational risk. That's intelligence jargon for this person has dangerous connections. So here's the real question. Did the palace know? And if they didn't, how did they not? Because if Doria was, at any point, engaged in helping dismantle a criminal operation, that would explain the sealed court record. It would explain the missing paper trail. It would explain the quiet security. But it would also raise a terrifying possibility that someone with insider knowledge of organized fraud schemes managed to quietly insert herself into the heart of the British monarchy. Not as a threat, not with malice, but by default, by existing within Meghan's life and being protected at every step. You might be wondering, why was this file sealed in the first place? One source claims the operation involved a now-defunct real estate ring in South Los Angeles. Think fraudulent mortgages, identity theft, elder exploitation. A multi-million-dollar enterprise that preyed on low-income communities with fake investment pitches and bogus properties. Doria, allegedly, had once worked in proximity to one of the operation's key players. Not knowingly, at first. But when she realized what was happening, and the ring began collapsing, she flipped. That's the story insiders now whisper. And that's where things get deeply contradictory. Because if Doria helped law enforcement, why wouldn't that work in her favor? Why the secrecy? Why the silence? Why bury it? 2 possible reasons. 1, because the ring was bigger than anyone realized, and exposing it fully would have implicated high-level individuals still walking free. 2, because Doria may not have been entirely innocent. Some records allegedly show her name tied to accounts that processed fees from these transactions. Whether she benefited or not is unclear, but the paper trail exists, which makes her both an asset and a liability. And if that had gone public during Meghan's royal ascension, it would have been catastrophic. That's why the palace kept her in the background. That's why she was treated with kid gloves. That's why the allowance existed. Not as a gift, as a containment plan. But the leaks shattered that illusion. Once journalists got hold of the summaries, the real media storm began. Not tabloids, independent investigators. The kind who don't care about royal protocol. The kind who dig. Suddenly, investigative blogs and financial watchdogs began releasing their own findings. A now-deleted LinkedIn profile matching Doria's known background, connected to a business consultancy dissolved in 2003 under suspicious circumstances. An archived court document showing a signature that closely resembles Doria's, co-signing a vehicle purchase later tied to a bankruptcy fraud ring. Old neighborhood testimonies, anonymous, of course, suggesting Doria lived well above her means in the early 2000s despite no known income. And then came the smoking gun, a notarized property deed from 2001, showing a transfer of ownership from an entity later flagged by the FBI for fraudulent activity. The co-signer? Doria Ragland. Even if she wasn't prosecuted, even if she cooperated, even if she was used, the connection exists, and it can't be denied anymore. So when that file finally reached King Charles, and he turned to the last page, the page marked confidential, U.S. record sealed 2007, he knew exactly what he had to do. There was no strategy session, no committee, no formal inquiry. There was just one phone call. Doria's allowance terminated, her access revoked, her record purged from internal databases. She wasn't just removed, she was erased. But what's haunting royal insiders now is something even more disturbing. Because attached to the MI6 leak was a note, a single-line message written by one of the analysts who reviewed the sealed file. It read, "Possible proximity compromise. Subject may not be the only one." Let that sink in. They're not just concerned about Doria. They're worried about who she brought close. Which begs the question, did Meghan know? Did she ever ask about her mother's past? Did she ever suspect? Or worse, did she use it? Because if Doria's knowledge, connections, or experience helped Meghan navigate the complex world of royal power plays, media manipulation, and post-royal brand building, then this story isn't just about Doria. It's about a much bigger strategy. One built on silence. One built on secrecy. One that may have just started to crack. And here's where we leave off. Because while the MI6 file laid out the financial story, the court record confirmed the past. The next chapter is where things move into explosive territory. Because when King Charles ordered an emergency meeting at Sandringham to discuss the fallout, he wasn't just talking about cutting off Doria. He was preparing for containment. And that meeting was unlike anything the palace had seen since the days of Princess Diana. What kind of court record is so sensitive, so potentially explosive, that it's sealed for over 20 years and still causes a royal panic the moment it resurfaces? What kind of document makes MI6 agents scramble, makes a monarch cancel his appointments, and prompts senior royals to fly in for an unscheduled emergency meeting at Sandringham? Because this wasn't just any sealed record. This wasn't about an unpaid parking ticket, a forgotten tax bill, or some minor legal oversight from a distant past. No, this court record had a name. It had a signature. It had a direct link to Doria Ragland. And it had one line that brought everything crashing down. Subject was involved in witness facilitation for financial misconduct involving vulnerable populations. Court recommends sealing under protection protocols. Let that marinate. Witness facilitation. Financial misconduct. Vulnerable populations. And the kicker? The phrase protection protocols. That's not normal language for a minor fraud case. That's the kind of language used when the court believes someone's testimony or cooperation could lead to retaliation or greater systemic exposure, which suggests that Doria Ragland wasn't just brushing up against wrongdoing. She was in the room where it happened. Let's walk through it. According to sources familiar with the unsealed portions of the document, the court record involved a multi-party investigation into fraudulent property sales targeting elderly homeowners in South Central Los Angeles in the late 1990s and early 2000s. These scams weren't new, but they were intricate, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Scammers would identify elderly, often minority, homeowners struggling with mortgage payments. They'd offer them a solution. A complicated refinancing scheme wrapped in friendly legalese. The homeowners would sign documents they didn't understand, often in exchange for a few $100s up front. And within weeks, their homes were no longer theirs. Deeds were transferred. Loans were ballooned. Evictions came quickly. The scammers flipped the properties for massive profit, often using shell companies to hide the trail. Thousands of homes, millions of dollars, dozens of lives ruined. The FBI got involved around 2002. A task force was formed. Wiretaps were used. Bank accounts frozen. Court proceedings began quietly in 2004. Now, where does Doria fit in? Here's where it gets chilling. One of the companies flagged in the investigation was allegedly tied, by paper trail, to a boutique yoga wellness consultancy Doria co-founded in 1999. Not a criminal front. Not a fraud ring. Just connected. The company shared an accountant with one of the defendants. That accountant was later indicted. And when investigators started combing through records, they found at least 3 financial transactions that linked Doria's company to entities involved in the housing scam. It was unclear if she knew. That's the twist. Was she complicit? Or just collateral? According to the court record, Doria agreed to speak to investigators under condition of anonymity. She provided limited but valuable information: names, dates, behavioral patterns, appointment schedules. She claimed to have no knowledge of the fraud, but could confirm certain individuals had approached her with consulting offers that she declined. The investigators, in turn, agreed to seal her testimony under the court's protection protocols. That meant shielding her name, sealing her documents, and ensuring she could never be publicly linked to the case, unless she became a criminal defendant, which she never was. But here's the irony. That seal, once her shield, became a sword when the palace discovered it. Because Charles's advisors, especially his new crop of reform-minded aides, weren't just looking for what Doria did. They were asking what Doria knew and didn't tell. That subtle distinction matters. Because the sealed court record confirms that she was aware, if only tangentially, of one of the largest housing scams in Los Angeles history. And she said nothing. Not to the press. Not to the palace. Not even during Meghan's most vulnerable royal moments. Imagine being King Charles. You've already weathered the storm of Harry and Meghan's departure. You've survived Oprah. You've dodged Netflix's knives. Now you're handed a legal document proving that the mother of your estranged daughter-in-law once cooperated with federal investigators in a case involving the systematic exploitation of elderly black homeowners, and never disclosed it. What does that do to the Crown's public narrative? How does that affect the palace's claim of full transparency during Meghan's integration? What does it say about their vetting process? And worse, what if this had come out from someone else first? A reporter, a blogger, a whistleblower. That would have caused a media meltdown, which is why Charles convened the meeting at Sandringham. It was unprecedented in tone, urgent, defensive, and for the first time since Megxit, totally united. William was there, and was there. Even Edward reportedly dialed in remotely, and the message was clear. Doria must be cut off, not out of revenge, out of survival, because this wasn't just a PR problem anymore. It was a national trust issue. How could the British monarchy claim accountability and oversight if they were secretly supporting someone with sealed testimony in a federal exploitation case? The answer was, they couldn't. And so the Doria Protocol was born. Here's what insiders say it included. Immediate termination of financial support. All discretionary payments, security coverage, and indirect allowances halted. No explanation given. Internal audit of all Sussex-adjacent financial ties. A forensic review of any funding channels, including obscure trusts and royal favor payments, going back to 2018. Communications blackout. Royal aides were instructed not to answer any questions from the press regarding Doria. No comment became gospel. Preventative distance. Any future events or royal engagements involving the Sussexes would not include Doria, explicitly or otherwise. Legal consultation with U.S. authorities. The palace's legal team began reaching out, quietly, to American officials to understand the full scope of the sealed record and what risks remained. Now, here's where it gets even darker. Because the court record also references one other detail, and this is the one Charles reportedly reacted to most emotionally. A section of the sealed document includes mention of a minor present during informal meetings at the primary residence of witness A. That minor? Unconfirmed. But timelines suggest it could have been Meghan, meaning the palace is now staring down the possibility that the Duchess of Sussex, as a child, was within arm's length of a federal investigation involving criminal activity. Think about the optics. Think about the headlines. Think about the hypocrisy after years of royal messaging about integrity, background checks, family values, and public responsibility. And yet, no one is talking. Not officially. Because to confirm the court record's contents would be to open the gates to scrutiny the palace might not survive. So instead, they cut her off. Silently, efficiently, and with no warning. Doria, sources say, was informed via her legal counsel that she would no longer be covered under royal discretionary arrangements. Security reassigned. Travel privileges revoked. Existing support structures collapsed overnight. One insider said the letter was only 3 sentences long. That's how brutal it was. And while Meghan remained silent, publicly, at least, sources say she was blindsided, furious, devastated, not just for her mother, but because she feared what else might surface. Because the sealed court record wasn't the end. It was the beginning, and buried within it was a list of affiliated individuals. Names not yet redacted. Names that could implicate others. Names that could blow the Sussex narrative apart. Which leads us to the next crisis. Because once the sealed file was circulated inside the palace, a question arose. A question no one wanted to ask. A question that could change everything. Did Meghan know about her mother's past? Or had Doria, by design or by instinct, kept her daughter in the dark? Because if Meghan knew, and still brought Doria into the royal spotlight, still allowed her to appear in the Netflix doc, still permitted her to benefit from palace resources, then the scandal isn't about one woman's hidden past. It's about a calculated deception, and that would break the monarchy in a way even Harry's memoir couldn't. Because this time, it wouldn't be about race, or press intrusion, or outdated tradition. It would be about trust. And trust, once broken, cannot be rebuilt. Which is why the palace's next move wasn't just about Doria. It was about survival. And survival, in the world of kings and queens, requires a sacrifice. But the palace wasn't done yet. Because just as they were closing ranks, locking down files, and silencing aides, a new discovery emerged. And it came not from a royal source, not from MI6, not even from a journalist. It came from someone no one expected. A voice from Doria's past. Someone who claimed to know everything. Someone who said, she wasn't just near the fire, she lit it. What happens when a monarch realizes he's been played? Not just manipulated, not just misled, but systematically deceived by someone standing on the outer edge of his family tree? That's what insiders say King Charles felt as the MI6 briefings unfolded, page by damning page. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief hardened into fury. And that fury didn't fade, it focused. And it had one target. Doria Ragland. Make no mistake, Charles is not known for emotional outbursts. He's been trained since birth to maintain poise, diplomacy, and discretion, even behind closed doors. But those who were in the room during the Sandringham summit say this was different. They use words like combustion, controlled rage, cold, surgical disbelief. Because this wasn't just about Doria's past. It was about what that past had cost him, and what it could still destroy. The meeting wasn't scheduled. It wasn't planned. It wasn't part of a strategic calendar. It was called emergency status at 9:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. By 8 a.m. the next morning, every senior royal advisor, 2 top MI6 liaisons, and 3 senior members of the royal family were either en route or patched in via encrypted line. The location? Sandringham House. Private. Secure. Historically significant. The same estate where Queen Elizabeth summoned Princes Charles, William, and Harry in 2020 to finalize the Sussex departure deal. Now it was happening again. But this time, Harry wasn't invited. This wasn't about the Sussexes, at least not directly. This was about containment. Because the revelations about Doria hadn't just exposed a private scandal. They had compromised the credibility of the palace itself. And Charles? He was livid. According to insiders, Charles opened the meeting not with a discussion, but with a statement. He walked into the room holding a copy of the MI6 dossier and placed it flat on the table. He looked at everyone. His aides, his sister Princess, and his son William, and said, I will not have this monarchy dragged into scandal by people who don't even belong to it. Silence. Then he added, I want every trace of this woman's entanglement with the crown removed. Today. Quietly. Permanently. That was the tone. What followed was a 4-hour closed-door crisis session that, according to one insider, made Megxit look like a birthday brunch. The agenda? 5 parts. Verification of the file. MI6 officials confirmed the authenticity of the sealed court document. No fabrications. No gray areas. The information was real, and worse, more could still surface. Scope of exposure. How far had Doria's reach gone? What financial or reputational damage could emerge if the leaks continued? The answer, potentially devastating. Meghan's charity ventures, her book deals, her Netflix and Spotify earnings. If Doria's past touched any of these ventures, even indirectly, they could be legally scrutinized. Damage to sovereign grand integrity. Parliament had already begun whispering. Investigative reporters had started circling. If Doria had received any indirect benefit from public money, Charles could face pressure to address it publicly. Strategic distance. How could the palace now sever ties with Doria without appearing cruel, without triggering a media backlash, and without giving Meghan an excuse to claim victimhood on a global stage? Emotional fallout. Would this ignite another round of attacks from the Sussexes? Was Meghan prepared to defend her mother in the press? Would Harry be weaponized again? But here's the twist no one saw coming. In the middle of the meeting, an encrypted message arrived from the Foreign Office. It contained new intelligence, not about Doria's finances, but about someone from her past. A woman, a former associate, a name only vaguely familiar until that moment. Her file was thin, her background check incomplete. But she was traced back to Doria's yoga consultancy days in the early 2000s. She had no digital presence, no press, just one thing that triggered alarm. She'd submitted an anonymous tip to a British journalist 2 days earlier. And in that tip, she claimed, Doria knew what she was doing. She taught others how to hide money. I was one of them. Let that sink in. If true, it meant Doria wasn't just loosely connected to fraud. She had actively facilitated it, taught it, replicated it. And the palace never saw it coming. When Charles read this part of the file, he reportedly put his hand over his mouth and said nothing. But the fury was visible. His aides, trying to remain composed, quietly passed around the updated intelligence. One of them allegedly turned to William and muttered under his breath, "How the hell did this woman get so close?" William, by all accounts, was ice cold. Princess, and ever the stoic operator, allegedly broke the tension with a single remark. "Because we let her, and we'll never make that mistake again." That line changed the energy in the room. Suddenly, the meeting wasn't about outrage. It was about execution. How to act, how to erase, how to protect the monarchy. Here's what they decided, minute by minute. 9:55 a.m., royal discretionary accounts frozen. Any funding pipelines remotely connected to Doria, through charities, security firms, or soft support, expenses, were terminated. 10:12 a.m., private security assets recalled. Doria's bodyguards, formerly sourced through a private royal contractor, were ordered to stand down. 10:34 a.m., royal liaison to U.S. State Department activated. A diplomatic backchannel was opened. Quiet queries were made regarding the court file and whether U.S. authorities were planning any further action. 11:15 a.m., internal memo to staff issued. All inquiries related to Ms. Ragland are to be referred to legal counsel. No statements to press. No off-record briefings. Total silence. 12:03 p.m., Charles makes final decision. The king reportedly turned to William and said, "She is not to be discussed again. Ever. As far as this family is concerned, she never existed." Cold. Absolutely. But necessary? In their eyes, yes. Because the crown, more than anything, survives on image. And image depends on control. And Doria? She was a fracture in the facade. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. That meeting, secret, shadowy, sealed from the public, also revealed a private rift, not between Charles and William, but between Charles and Meghan. According to insiders, Charles demanded that the palace reach out to the Sussex camp, not for diplomacy, not for clarity, for legal indemnification. He wanted written confirmation that Meghan had no prior knowledge of her mother's court-sealed past. A declaration, signed and dated, stating that any business ties, ventures, or financial activities involving Doria were conducted without Meghan's awareness or involvement. In other words, he wanted a scapegoat clause. Because if the public tide turned, if Parliament demanded explanations, if the press launched a full assault, Charles needed distance. And Meghan? She needed to choose. Defend her mother, or protect herself. But before she could even respond, the storm escalated. Because as the Sandringham meeting ended and the palace's emergency cleanup began, a voicemail surfaced, 5 seconds long, sent between two encrypted accounts, traced to Meghan's private communications hub in Montecito. And that voicemail? It wasn't from a royal. It wasn't from a lawyer. It wasn't from an aide. It was from Doria. And she said one thing: move fast. They're coming. What exactly was Doria Ragland warning her daughter about? Why did she choose those words, short, urgent, and hauntingly vague? Move fast. They're coming. Coming for what? Coming for whom? Because here's the part that no one at the palace, no MI6 agent, no private investigator, and no royal press secretary was prepared for. The possibility that the scandal didn't end with Doria Ragland. It began with her. And what if that 5-second voicemail wasn't just a mother trying to protect her child, but a business partner trying to contain a collapse? Because as the leaks widened and the sealed court record began rippling through the highest tiers of royal crisis management, another question clawed its way to the surface. Did any of this touch Meghan's financial empire? And if so, how deep? Let's rewind. Since stepping back from royal duties in 2020, Meghan Markle has curated a post-palace brand unlike anything we've seen before. One part activist, one part influencer, one part global duchess with a Hollywood shine. The buzzwords came fast and thick: authenticity, empowerment, feminist entrepreneurship, reclaiming the narrative. But behind the TED Talk glow and curated Netflix confessionals, something else was brewing. A growing network of companies, shell entities, licensing deals, distribution rights, royalties, and at the center of it all, a single, little-known LLC registered in Delaware in early 2019. Let's call it Emerald Bay Ventures. The real name is under redaction, but multiple sources point to this alias. Now, on the surface, it looked harmless. A standard holding company, private, low profile, listed to a business manager with ties to both Meghan and Harry. But when analysts began mapping the entity's financial behavior, red flags began to flash. One particularly sharp-eyed forensic accountant, hired by an independent royal oversight group, noticed something odd: a pattern of small incoming transfers from Los Angeles-based consulting firms. Firms that no longer existed. Firms that were dissolved within 2 years of being created. The amounts weren't large. £4,000 here, £12,300 there. A £7,900 contract advisory retainer. Small enough to dodge headlines. Large enough to make an investigator lean forward. Why? Because two of those now-defunct firms had previously listed Doria Ragland as either a consultant or board advisor in their original incorporation documents. Boom. There it was. The crack in the glass. Now, let's be clear. Meghan has never been accused of criminal wrongdoing. There is no public evidence that she participated in or facilitated any of her mother's alleged past activities. But business is about structure, and structure doesn't care about optics. And the deeper analysts dug into Meghan's empire, the more those structures began to shimmer with contradictions. Let's list a few. TIG Ventures, LLC, registered shortly after the Sussexes moved to the U.S., purportedly dormant. Yet it received a sudden $95,000 licensing fee from a consultancy in early 2022, just weeks before Meghan's podcast Archetypes debuted. Pearl Media Holdings, a short-lived firm attached to an animated Netflix series that was later shelved. Doria's name never appears. But a woman listed as L. Ragland Doyle handled creative development outreach. Coincidence? Or deliberate camouflage? Archwell Foundation, promoted as the Sussexes' charitable arm. Recently updated tax filings showed consulting disbursements that analysts say were routed through 2 layers of LLCs before landing in a California-based firm once co-managed by a former associate of Doria's. Still think that voicemail was just a mother's concern? Or was it something more calculated? Let's go further. According to a leaked internal communication obtained by an investigative media consortium, Meghan's team began purging old business records within 48 hours of the MI6 file being received by the palace. That included archiving company websites, terminating domain name registrations, reassigning managing partners, updating mailing addresses to overseas locations, primarily in Ireland and the Cayman Islands. One entity even attempted to reclassify itself as inactive due to dissolution. But it failed. The filing came too late. And that's where the panic set in. Because when you start cleaning house before the public knows something is wrong, you look guilty, even if you're not. So let's ask the real question here. Was Doria laundering her past through Meghan's post-royal fame? Or was Meghan's brand, unwittingly or not, built on the bones of Doria's unfinished chapters? Because suddenly, the dots start connecting fast. Meghan's first major Hollywood contract, negotiated by a team that included a financier who once represented a client tied to Doria's 2001 real estate circle. A now-defunct lifestyle company, allegedly shared a tax preparer with one of Doria's short-lived yoga wellness firms. An international women's empowerment brand launched with great fanfare in